Thank you, Madam President. And I wanted to come to the floor today to follow up on the news that we've had on this IRS situation, which I know is concerning to all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, everyone. The power of government is real, and the power of the IRS is very real. And so anytime anything involves an abuse of power in the IRS, it's going to concern Americans irrespective of their political leanings. Before I do, I just want to comment on something that happened a few minutes ago in a press conference at the White House. And I have tremendous respect for the office of the presidency and for anyone who would hold themselves up to hold the office. And so I say this with the highest of respect. I think that the president today in his press conference potentially made a mistake in an answer that he gave, and I would encourage the White House to clear it up as soon as possible. He was asked specifically if he or anyone in the White House knew about what was going on at the IRS before April 22nd of this year. And the president's answer was that he didn't know about the Inspector General's report until he read about it in the press. So I would submit to you that he did not answer that question. And I'm not implying that he did know about it. I'm just encouraging the White House and those there to clear this up as soon as possible. It's kind of reminiscent of when Attorney General Holder would not answer Senator Paul's question about whether American citizens could be targeted in the homeland with a drone. And that led, we all remember, to what it led to. So it's just a very simple and straightforward question. And I would encourage the White House and the President to echo what Jay Carney said just a couple days ago, which is no one in the White House knew anything about it. And I think it's important for the President to answer that clearly. Again, not because I'm implying that he did know, but because I think if you leave that out there, it creates questions, and that shouldn't be created. And I hope that they will do that. It's important. I want to bring to the attention of the Senate and to the American people a compilation of stories that have emerged since the initial question emerged, and they're very, very troubling, and they extend, quite frankly, beyond the IRS. But I'll begin with the IRS. Here's a report from the Washington Examiner. The headline reads, "The IRS denied tax-exempt status to pro-lifers on behalf of Planned Parenthood." But let me read what it says inside. It says, "In one case, the IRS withheld approval of an application for tax-exempt status for Coalition for Life of Iowa. And in a phone call that this reporter reporting here had with one of the leaders, one of the leaders claims that in a phone call that he had with the IRS on June 6th of 2009, the IRS agent, Ms. Richards, told the group to send a letter to the IRS with the entire board's signature stating that under perjury of law, they do not picket / protest or organize groups to picket or protest outside of Planned Parenthood. And they said that once the IRS received this letter, this application would be approved." That's troubling if true. So that's one report that's in the news. Here's another one. This one comes from a very respected individual in the United States. His name is Franklin Graham. He's the son of the Reverend Billy Graham. And he claims that the Billy Graham Evangelical Association and the Family's International Humanitarian Organization, Samaritan Purse, the IRS notified them in September that it was conducting a, quote, review of their activities for tax year 2010. He goes on to say, by the way, that this review happened after Mr. Graham's organization published newspaper ads in North Carolina backing a state constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. That's in the news. Here's another, that was from Politico. Again, I'm just reporting different outlets what they're reporting. This is another report that has been out there. I think I alluded to this yesterday in my speech. This talks about how the same IRS office that deliberately targeted conservative groups applying for tax-exempt status in the run-up to the 2012 election released 9 pending confidential applications of conservative groups to ProPublica in late last year. In fact, I think this is actually ProPublica admitting that that's where they got the information from. This was in response to a request for the applications for 67 different nonprofits last November. So this is an admission basically here from ProPublica, which is this not-for-profit investigative reporting group. They're admitting that the source of these leaked documents was the IRS office in Cincinnati, the leaked document of 9 conservative groups. So now it's no longer audits, it's cooperating with investigative journalists by providing them information which is illegal to provide them, confidential tax information. That's what this report says from the organization who got the leak. This is Fox News Latino. It reports that the former president of the San Antonio Tea Party said that they received a questionnaire with over 50 questions, including inquiries into whether the group met with, who the group met with, where their meetings were held, who was in attendance, the subject of internal emails, et cetera, et cetera. This, I think, is just in line with some of the other stories we've been hearing around the country. This was actually posted online, and these are letters going back and forth between the Richmond Tea Party and the IRS. This is the actual letters here that we pulled online with some information redacted for privacy. And just some of the questions they were asked. Provide the following information for all events and programs you have conducted and participated from October 22nd to now. They wanted copies of handouts you provided to the audience. If there were any speeches or forums conducted in the event or program, provide detailed contents of the speeches or forums, the names of the speakers and panels, their credentials, the names of persons from your organization and the amount of time they spent on the event or the program. Indicate the percentage of time and resources you spent on all the events and programs in relation to your activity. It goes on and on. These are pages after pages after pages after pages of information being asked of a citizen group from the IRS. And anyone who's gotten a letter from the IRS understands it's never a pleasant thing unless there's a refund check in that envelope. You go in the mailbox, you open it, it says IRS, and everyone doesn't like that. Now just imagine this group of everyday citizens. These are not professional political activists. They don't have entire law firms at their disposal. These are just everyday Americans who are speaking out about the principles of limited government and free enterprise. And by the way, they were speaking out in favor of big government, or whatever. They'd still have the same right not to be harassed by the IRS. So I just want to bring the real face of this to bear, because this is not just a problem with an abuse of power in the IRS. Think about the application this has had on the lives of everyday Americans who one day decided, I want to get involved in politics, I want to speak out, I want to say something, and you get hit with a letter like this kind of questionnaire, which quite frankly, what happens with a lot of these groups is they just decide, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to speak out, I'm not going to get involved, I don't have the time for this, and I don't need the hassle. Maybe that was the intent. So we went over that for a moment. Here's something that's really troubling. This is from USA Today. USA Today headlines, IRS approved liberal groups while Tea Party in limbo. Some of these groups were approved in as little as 9 months. Bus for Progress in New Jersey, a not-for-profit that uses red, white, and blue buses to drive the progressive change. Missourians organizing for reform and empowerment. They got their tax-exempt status just 9 months after a pretty simple and straightforward process. Progress Florida, in my own home state, similar experience. Again, this is the USA Today. I think this was their cover story yesterday, where it described the differences of how Tea Party groups are treated in comparison to groups that had things in their title like Progress or Progressive. Here's one more that actually shows that this kind of behavior extends beyond the entire Internal Revenue Service. This is from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, May 14th, and it talks about how public records produced by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in response to a lawsuit filed by CEI under the Freedom of Information Act, shows a pattern of making it far more difficult for limited government groups, in particular those who argue for more freedom and less EPA, how it makes it harder for them to get access to public records. So, for example, green groups such as the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, Earth Justice, they had their fees waived in 75 out of 82 cases. Meanwhile, the EPA effectively or expressly denied CEI's request for fee waivers in 14 of its 15 requests. 14 of its 15 requests. So that's 93% of the time versus basically the alternative here, which what they did with these other groups. Again, all a chain and a pattern of behavior that I think is really not anything any of us ever want to see. And so far, I haven't seen it, and I don't think we're going to, quite frankly. I suspect you won't see a single member of Congress come to the floor of either chamber and say this is acceptable behavior. I want to tie in the loop, though, because this is not just about these agencies run amok. This is not just about a handful of people in the IRS, a Cincinnati office, or somewhere else doing something wrong. I mean, this is much deeper than that. And I've talked about it yesterday, I'll repeat it today, and that's a sense that this administration has pursued a real culture of intimidation in the political process, both through the way it ran its campaign. But I want to take it one step further. What this really should remind us of is the dangers of government power. Let me stop there and remind someone of everything. We need government. No one here, I don't know any anarchists that serve in the U.S. government for the most part. All of us believe that government has an important role to play in our country, the national defense. We, by and large, believe that there needs to be a safety net to help those who cannot help themselves, not as a way of life, but to help those who have fallen to stand up and try again. We think the government plays an important role in our laws. I mean, one of the things that attracts people to the U.S., for example, to do business here, is that we have a legal system where your property rights are going to be respected. So if you say you own a piece of property, it belongs to you. No one would necessarily dispute that. And if they do, you have to go to court. There are countries in the world where the owner of the property is whoever has the bigger guns or whoever has the best connection to government. And so we take that for granted sometimes, but in the United States, so there's a role for government to play, and it's a very important role. But the problem is that our framers, the founders of this nation, had a deep suspicion of government, no matter who was running the government. They rejected this notion that if you just put really good people in government, you'll have really good government. Government has a role to play, but when government's powers extend beyond its natural limits or its important limits, you start to have problems like this emerge. And I bring this to the core because this is exactly what we've been debating here in so many instances, is expanding the natural power of government beyond where it should be and allowing it to have jurisdiction and influence over areas of our life where no matter who's in charge, Republican or Democrat, you may not like the way it turns out. We talked about the IRS for a moment. The IRS is going to be on the front lines of enforcing the health care law. So this is the same agency of government that has, for the most part, over the last few years, now by admission of everyone involved, been abusing the power, at least some of their employees have. I don't want to besmirch the entire agency. As Senator Hatch was saying a moment ago, there are very good people that work all throughout government who would never participate in this sort of behavior. But my point is, this is the agency that was targeting Americans because they were organizing themselves as conservatives. This is now the agency that's going to be empowered with new powers it's never had before. The power to force every American to either buy health insurance or pay a fine. Buy health insurance or pay a tax. And in the weeks to come, I'm going to be outlining examples of why giving government more power than it should have creates situations like this, the potential for situations like this to occur. There was enormous wisdom in limiting the power of the federal government that our framers had. Enormous wisdom in that. That's why they specifically said, if this Constitution doesn't give the federal government this power, it doesn't have it. And we sometimes forget that lesson 2 centuries later, but we shouldn't. That's an important limit. And I think we can have an honest debate about what role government should be playing in our lives and in our economies. There could be an honest debate about that, because there is a role for government to play. There is an important role for government to play in our country, but it can go too far, whether it's in the realm of civil liberties or economic liberties. And that's what I think the debate should really be focused on in the weeks to come, in addition to getting to the bottom of what's happened here, understanding clearly what's happened here. You know, I'm involved in another endeavor, immigration reform. One of the biggest impediments to immigration reform that I am facing, that we are facing, is this distrust of the federal government, the belief that they're not going to enforce the law. No matter what we pass or what we put in place, they're not going to do it. We tried this 20, 30 years ago, they didn't do it. And that's unfortunate. I hope we can overcome that. I believe we can. Because the truth is that the vast majority of Americans, vast majority of Republicans, Democrats, independents, are willing to deal with the fact that we have 11 million people living in this country illegally, so long as we can ensure that this problem never happens again in the future. They're willing to deal with that. And we have to win their confidence that, in fact, the measures that we're going to take are going to prevent that from happening in the future. But we're struggling because people have such a distrust of the government's willingness or ability to enforce the law. So you see it even in that issue rear its head. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that even if government is run by the best people with the best of intentions, it has a tendency to do these sorts of things. You see that at every level, but particularly at the federal level, where it has such enormous powers. And so anytime we come here and debate giving government a new power or a new agency or a new mandate or a new jurisdiction, we should be cognizant of the history of government power. We should be cognizant of what it's meant throughout human history. We should remember why the framers limited that power to begin with. It's because they understood that that power could be abused. And so I'll close by just saying that in the weeks to come, I know that I, along with all my colleagues here, just want to get to the bottom of this. We want to understand from the IRS's perspective who was involved in doing this, why did this happen, and more importantly, what can we do now to make sure that this never ever happens again? What can we do now to ensure that not just in the IRS, but across the government, that a situation like this never happens again? So no matter what your political persuasion may be, no American ever feels afraid to speak out politically because they may wind up the target of governmental action.